draw your attention to the transformation power of data with our keynote today. You've seen him up already. He's a bronze sponsor, Mr. Michael Van Dijk, the CEO and co-founder of All Your Business Intelligence. So Michael's going to explore further the revolutionary approaches to utilizing data beyond your traditional analysis and emphasizing its potential to fundamentally really reshape business strategies and outcomes. So prepare to see your data in a new lens. As we welcome again on stage Michael Van Dijk. Thank you.
Alrighty. So imagine a world where we're going to be with fewer individuals working, while at the same time we want to keep the same prosperity, the same welfare, economical welfare that we have today. So by 2050, we will face quite a dramatic demographical change. The predictions are that by 2050 we will have 2 working individuals for every single retired individual, where currently that ratio is actually 3-to-1. So that means we will have less people working than we do today. And the funny thing is that demographics don't lie, really, right? We cannot speed up the birthing process. We cannot speed up the aging process. So this is more or less a fact that's going to happen in a couple of years. So the big question is, how do we sustain the welfare, sustain the prosperity, and overall increase the welfare that we have today, while we were going to have a lower amount of working class individuals? So what I want to share with you is a little bit of my perspective of what's happening around us. Why is data such a hot topic? Why we're always talking about it? And what is changing around us, and how can we actually leverage it successfully? So as I mentioned before, right? Nowadays, or in 2050, the projections are that we're going to have 2 working individuals for every single retired one. So people are getting older, and we just have less birth than we have before, where today that ratio is 3-to-1. And one of the things to tackle that efficiency increase that we need to have is by leveraging technology. But we cannot just simply throw technology at it, right? Because that's not going to help us effectively. And with throwing and leveraging more technology, we have a new challenge that comes up. And that is the amount of data that we generate on a yearly or daily basis. So the estimations and the projections are, and that's what's been shown here on this graph, is what's the amount of data in zettabytes that we generate on a yearly basis. And it's not per se the number that is really interesting, it's the trajectory, the growth level that is really interesting. So while we start leveraging more and more technology, we start to generate more and more data in different types of forms, right? It's not only the structured data, it's unstructured data as well. So the question becomes, how can we then actually leverage all that data? And what we also see is that there's a lot of investments coming up. People are investing heavily in data. But at the same time, we don't see that every company is actually succeeding in utilizing that data. So McKinsey research actually shows that only 30% of the organizations that are investing in data and digital transformation are actually successful. So that means that 70% are not. So then the big question becomes, everybody is in it, but not everybody is winning with data. So how can we ensure that you can actually leverage that data? And how can you ensure you capture the wave? Because research also shows that those 30% of the companies that actually leverage data successfully, they really outperform the competitors. So, and that is not only, here I've just shown revenue and operational efficiency, but it's across a big broad domain list where you really see that improvement. And on average, it's 50%. So we have 50% more efficiency when you leverage data effectively compared to your competitors who do not have that. So the potential is there. We understand that the data is important, but there is still the trick that there's only a couple of us that really leverage it successfully. So the question really here is, what separates the data leaders from the data laggards? And I think one of the reasons that you can explain and understand what is the challenge here is explained by Martek's law. So what Martek's law actually tells us is that on one hand, technological advancements are really, really rapidly, while the organizational appetite for change and leveraging that technology is relatively slow. So that means that over time, that gap between organizational acceptance and leveraging the technology versus the growth of the technology itself, that gap just widens. And there's a risk here. And that risk is a little bit of like fear of missing out. So the FOMO effect, like we have to use technology nowadays because everybody around us is using it. Technology is growing, and otherwise we keep lagging it. But then we just start to focus on implementing and throwing technology at it. So we fall into the technological trap, where we just say, okay, we need to use AI, we need to build this dashboard, we need to have that report available, without missing the link of what's really the business objective that we want to achieve. So I argue that the true value from data is not a technology problem, it's a business transformation challenge. And one way I like to compare it with is actually training and building the muscles and building your body. If you want to train for, just health reasons, or you want to compete, you have to train your body, and you cannot just go to the gym once and expect, results the other day, right? It's a continuous effort, a continuous training. You have to look at what your body is made of. What kind of diet works really well for you, and what kind of exercise is working. You have to have consistency. So there's certain phases that you go through while training your body, and I think the same applies for the phases that you have in your data maturity. So we generally call this the data maturity model, but as I've linked it to the muscle, I thought it would be funny to have it as the data muscle phases. So this projection shows a little bit of what are those different phases that you go through as an organization, and how you can actually leverage the value from data. So what we talk about a lot recently is AI, right? And we believe that's really on the far right side, because AI is going to help you to leverage the data and look more forwards. But without the data, historical data, based on what are you going to do, the predictions. Right, so it starts with building that foundation. And what I think is really important here, and that's why we have those two color schemes, is that there's two components that really help you on driving. On one hand, it's a technological solution. So you need to have the fundamental technological environment that actually allows different types of users to access the data in a safe, secure way, while not being a IT guy or programmer, to write the code to actually get some data out of it, right? It needs to be accessible for everyone. So that's one component. And the other one is, we've talked about a little bit briefly before already, is the data-driven culture. So, and creating the environment where everybody understands the potential of data and how you can leverage it and what ways it forms. And if you look in over the growth and the different maturity phases, what you see is that in the first phases, what is more the emphasis on is building that technological environment. Right? Because if you don't have the data accessible and ready to use, then you can build the culture, but they can't grasp the data. So logically, you will need first that environment. But already relatively quickly, once you go to a more centralized environment or self-service environment, which means that you have the data available and people can actually leverage it, that's where that culture really starts to be an impacting factor of your overall business value. And that just grows over time. And to organize yourself around it, what we generally see is what's shown here, right? You have the C-level executive, and whether that's a CTO or IT director, or depending on the name, right? But you have the IT department, and then the data team is generally set under the IT department. And we've had this discussion just before in our panelists, right? That it was pointed out that there's just one guy or girl in the organization that's part of the IT team that knows everything about data. And that's not really going to help you on really drive the value. What I think you should aim for is creating a data function around the whole organization so that it becomes embedded within the organization. It's not just going to be part of the IT department and a data team in there, but it's going to spread out across the whole company. Because having that data function allows you actually to have super users from different environments, from different departments that understand the data, understand the processes, understand how you can actually figure out what's happening within the organization and actually leverage it. So how do we then generate a return on investment on our data investments? So I think there's two components that we talked about already briefly before, right? On one hand, we have the data-driven culture. That's really, for me, the willingness of leveraging data within the organization. And on the other hand, you have the data literacy, where we had the whole panel discussion just now, which is for me really the skill, the knowledge, the capabilities of really leveraging that. So those two are really at the forefront of making a successful business case and turning data into a valuable resource. But how do you go about actually achieving that? I think you start with building the strategy, turning your business strategy into a data strategy, having a clear vision and a yearly OKR roadmap, and I'll dive in what OKRs stand for and how we leverage that in a little bit, that aligns with your business objectives. And from there, you create a roadmap of leveraging step-by-step those and reaching those objectives and matching that with all the data opportunities that you have. Second component is innovation and data culture. And this is really about how do you accelerate that data-drivenness and solving actual company challenges that are happening within your organization, and having those use cases, collecting those use cases, and using ways to really determine what's happening in the organization, what are those different use cases that we see, and then use that as input for the next phase, which is the whole development. And that development is all about having the right organizational team, having the multidisciplinary full stack development team that actually builds the technological solution to help you answer the questions you have today. So this is really about building that bottom part, the technical architecture that I showed in the maturity model. And then last but definitely not least, it's constantly optimizing, right? It's monitoring that environment, which kind of reports are using, which ones are outdated, which could be taken out or obsolete, to keep that environment and everything that you have running smoothly and ensure that you don't have, I think this is going to be a Dutch translation literally to English, but a wild growth of different reports that are just popping up everywhere, not being leveraged to the fullest. So really keeping a control of what you have available. And then you repeat that cycle. You look again at the quarterly objectives. Where are we right now? What was the yearly objective that we have, or the multi-yearly objective? Where are we against that bigger objective? And what is then important to do in the next quarter? And by constantly repeating this, you will get into a flow of constantly improving the environment, bringing the team along, helping them in their data maturity grow, and building that technological foundation that you need in order to answer all those questions. And I briefly touched about OKRs. So how do you then determine what are those objectives and key results? And that's what the OKRs come in. So OKR stands for Objectives, Key Results. I think it was originally, I keep forgetting that it's either Google or Intel that leveraged this or started this. But it really helps to narrow down the business objectives. So the OKR, the objective is, what is that goal? What is that on the horizon that we want to achieve? Where do we want to go? And that needs to be somewhat inspiring to achieve. Then the key result, as it says, is really the way to measure how far along are we in achieving that particular business objective. And that obviously needs to be time-bound and measurable. And this way you can actually really figure out, so the business objective that we have, how do we ensure that we're on the right track? Are we doing the right things to actually move towards that objective and hitting that? And then the last part is the initiatives. So all the things that you need to do, the tasks, the projects, and everything that comes with it to actually achieve that. And maybe to give an example of how we leverage it with one of our customers is, their business objective was, well, as a lot of companies will probably recognize, is growth. And growth from their perspective was growth in revenue. So their first focus was defining where do we get the growth from, and that was initially thought sales. So with sales objective defined to double the revenue, we set out the targets as well for, okay, how many people do we need to go through the funnel? What is the conversion rate? How can we increase that conversion rate? And those are key results you can actually measure in order to hit that bigger objective. Are we increasing the sales? And then one of the initiatives was having that data available. So that whole building the platform just becomes a relatively small but important element within the overall objective. And it's not an objective by itself, right? It's really a tool and a means to actually understand what is that hit rate, what's that conversion cycle, how many people do we need to get in, what's the overall funnel, and how do we achieve that bigger objective of doubling the sales revenue or increasing that. And from there, the roadmap becomes how do we get the collected data, what data do we need, where do we get it from, and that becomes an integral part of the initiatives. So that's how, from a data perspective and data strategy, you can actually leverage the OKR framework to make the technology a part of the innovation and the initiative. Then there's a lot to it, right? We talked about the technology, we talked about the whole organizational things around it. So building that data culture and building that data literacy comes across a lot of different components. So at first, it's the whole leadership part. Having the right vision from a top management level, where do we want to go? How do we see that we can actually leverage the data that we have in an effective way? And the second one is really sharing the success, having the commitment and the communication around it. That every time you have a use case that you had some success, or in some cases when you have some failures, but at least there's lessons learned there. Sharing those with the organization to really get everybody excited about what can be achieved and create tangible results within the organization. And an important thing to capture is managing the whole delivery. So it's actually an interesting thing that what we notice with some of our customers, in the beginning, it's relatively challenging to get the enthusiasm, right? There's only those one or two individuals that are excited by leveraging the data and are really at the forefront and helping you get started. But once you do that communication and objective settings right, you hit those objectives, and you'll see and share the success stories that you've built, you'll start to notice that a lot more people get excited. And you get a lot more questions like, if that is possible, can I then also do A, B, C, and D? And if that's then possible, can we then also do, or can I use that for my department? And that's where all the backlog and the additional questions come in. So having a delivery team ready for that scaling up phase where you get the team excited is really important. Because the moment that you then have to say, sorry, but we're too overloaded, we're too packed, we cannot deliver this within the next month or so, that's where you start to lose the appetite for it. And then you need to have the whole organization around it, right? So having the right team, having the right individuals collected, and working together on achieving this. And what's really important here is the whole governance and management, especially as you grow in that maturity. And it was pointed out in the previous panelist discussion as well. One of the risks that we saw with one of our customers that actually moved to that self-service phase is that there was again a wild growth of different reports. So not only Excel spreadsheets anymore, we got rid of those. So a lot of automated reports, but then now moved to Power BI. And if you look at the Power BI environment, there was 150 different reports that show revenue, that show some sales targets, that show some operational KPIs. So managing that and having the whole governance around that is really important to understand, okay, what are then the core company reports? What do we really leverage to steer the company from a leadership perspective? and what do we use for underlying analysis and figuring out where things could actually improve. And then obviously security, right? How do you create the environment and ensure that some of the financial numbers are not out there in the public? That will be handy. But also some of the HR, and in Europe you have the GDPR regulations, so we cannot analyze on individual basis or name based and point it back to one particular individual. That's not allowed. So how do you create the environment and ensure that although all that generation of data is available, only the right people have access to the right type of information at the right time? And then you have the whole technological part, so the whole data management part and building that architecture. As you build it out and expand on those different use cases, you don't want to constantly look at new platforms. You want to have it all centralized, right? So that you collect the data from the different sources, combine it there, and from there leverage it. So how do you ensure that even though you start small and you iterate on that, how do you build up on top of that platform with that bigger objective in mind? And that's really the whole data management part. And then last but definitely not least is the analytics. So what are the right analytical reports or capabilities that we need in order to actually get the insights that we are looking for? So, and I understand that this is a lot, right? So how do you then actually achieve this? Because this is not something you do overnight. There's a lot of different components, a lot of different moving parts. And that is really a challenge. So the way we do that is basically by iteration after iteration after iteration. So again, with that objectives and OKRs and mindsets, having that bigger objective and narrowing that down into quarterly objectives. So what is really that big thing that we have to move in the next quarter? And what is the insight that we need in order to progress in our organization? That's going to be the key element to focus on. And that's what you put in the first iteration. Work on that, deliver that quickly, get some results, get some intermediate feedback from the end users who are ultimately going to use whatever you've been building or developing or delivering. Get feedback from them, iterate on that, and don't expect the perfect solution from the get-go. It's better to have something that you can have a tangible result where you can have a conversation about, leverage that, and continuously build upon it. And then you iterate, iterate, and iterate. So what I would like to do and leave you with for the upcoming days is to think about the following questions. So what would your organization look like if every decision you make within the upcoming period is informed by data? So what's that future going to look like? Where are you right now? And then what is the gap? Because that will really help you figuring out where can I start, what's the immediate objective that I can achieve, and how to go from there. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and looking forward for additional discussions later on.
Thank you, Michael. I want to, you do have a couple minutes, so would you like to open it up for a question? Do we have a question from the audience? Please raise your hand. I will come over with the microphone. Don't all jump at once. I know there must be something. All right, and then I'm going to go up to you. I'll get you talking. I see first question here. Please introduce yourself so we know who you are.
Hi, Michael Obiabuchi, run Core Leaders International. Fantastic presentation, and thank you for the panel conversation as well. I'm struck by this last question, and I'm curious about how important is it to value the data, but also look beyond the data to make sure that you're making valuable insights. Because just from the earlier conversation and this, sometimes the data doesn't tell us all that we need. So how important is it to value the data, but also look beyond the data to get those insights?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it is massively important to really understand what's behind the data. So one of the the things that we try to do when we initiate and do sort of a kickoff is to set sort of the foundation where the overall objective is to constantly figure out where can we improve as an organization. And that's the main objective. It's not to say you're not doing your job correctly or that's not happening in the right way. It's really figuring out what are the potential areas of improvement. And by setting that stage, you create the mindset that it's not about, Big Brother is watching me and based on my performance and all the things that we do with collecting the data and everything, it's going to have maybe an impact on, at the end of my month, my salary and everything. It's really about how we build the organization and how can we move further. And setting that foundation is really important, and you have to constantly repeat that, right? Because indeed, in the panel discussion, it was also mentioned the risk of, I'm showing how I'm performing with my department. What if those numbers are not at the level where, my bosses or directors want me to be? Am I going to get fired? And having that C-level involved and setting that foundation, like, no, it's not about whether you do your job correctly. It's really figuring out where are we right now, what's the area for improvement, and how do we collectively ensure that we move in the right direction. Setting that station, that baseline is really important. Thank you.
We have one more? Okay. I see your hands. All right. Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Paul William Baird, Senior Chairman and CEO of Baird Enterprises out of Indianapolis, Indiana, USA. My question is, it sounds like all this data collection is for mature companies. Where would you recommend this for startups that usually don't start out with data collection?
So if I understand your question correctly, what do you do as a startup? When you start your company, where do you actually start with leveraging the data? That's an interesting. So I think fundamentally the process doesn't really change much because you still have, in the startup phase, if I go back to our startup phase, well, the main objective was obviously to generate revenue. So that becomes the initial focus. And in order to generate revenue, there are certain things that you need to do to generate revenue. So then, again, determining the process behind it on what we need to do to hit that bigger objective and actually grow, that was for us the starting point. And initially we had, the business model is hourly based, so hourly based invoicing. So one of the important KPIs for us was billability. We have a team and they have X amount of contract hours, and out of that we need them at least for a certain percentage to be billable, because that will generate revenue, and that means we can pay the salaries, get some profit in, and invest for the future, right? So the principle is, I think, still the same. What is at the different stages of a company, what is important to understand, and what do you need to know at that point, and what are then the underlying KPIs that you need to track and grasp. And then you will probably not have the ERP system available, right? It might be just a time registration tool linked to the projects. And yes, we started with Excel spreadsheet dumps to just get the data and have those initial insights. And then we moved to increasing that and iterate, make it more automated, etc. So thanks, nice question.
Give him a round of applause. Thank you, Michael. Great to have you here. Really nice to share your expertise on this stage. And there's no doubt there's going to be lots of time to ask you questions.
Definitely.
You got a lot of information to share, so thank you again for being up here in our keynote, okay?
Yes.